It happened 2 days ago. After years of using Airbnb with nothing but positive experiences, I finally hit a bad one. I'd always heard stories of people booking accommodations that turned out to be disasters, but I never thought I'd be one of them. For the most part, I'd trusted the reviews, the polished photos, and the ease of communication with hosts. This time, though, something went wrong. Really wrong. I found the listing after scrolling through countless options. It was advertised as a charming and cozy full apartment, with bright, inviting photos. The living room had tasteful furniture, the kitchen looked modern, and the bedroom had a big, comfy-looking bed with fluffy pillows. It was perfect for my quick one-night stay. The price, €60, was decent too. Nothing in the listing raised any alarms. So, I booked it without hesitation. For a while, everything seemed normal. The booking was confirmed, and I sent a message to the host introducing myself and asking for instructions to access the property. Days went by without a reply. 2 days before my trip, I still hadn't received any information. I messaged her again, politely asking for the details. Her response came late that night. It was vague. "It's all right," she wrote. "You'll get all the details once you get here." I should have canceled right then. Something about her reply didn't sit right with me, but I rationalized it. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she didn't want to overwhelm me with details I didn't need yet. I convinced myself everything would be fine. After all, I'd never had a bad experience before. Why would this be any different? The day of my trip arrived, and I still hadn't received clear instructions. I messaged her again during my train ride, asking for the address and any check-in details. She responded an hour later with a pin on a map. No address, no explanation, just a pin dropped in the middle of a residential area on the outskirts of town. My stomach tightened, but I told myself I was overthinking it. When I finally got there, I was greeted by a woman in her late 40s. Her appearance was unkempt, messy hair, worn clothes, and she had a peculiar way about her, as if she couldn't care less that I was standing at her door. Without much of a welcome, she ushered me inside. It was immediately clear this wasn't the apartment I had booked. She led me down a dim, narrow hallway that smelled faintly of dampness and mildew. The walls were chipped, the floor creaked underfoot, and the air was cold enough to see my breath. We reached a small bedroom at the end of the hall, and she gestured for me to enter. "This is it," she said. The room was tiny, barely enough space for a single bed and a small table shoved into the corner. The bed was unmade, with a thin blanket and a flat pillow. The window faced a busy highway, and I could hear the constant roar of passing cars. My suitcase barely fit in the room, and when I tried to set it down, I had to maneuver it around the bed just to keep the door clear. I tried to mask my disappointment. The listing had promised a full apartment. This was a damp, claustrophobic bedroom with no privacy. But it was late, and I was exhausted. I had errands to run that evening, and I was leaving early the next morning. I figured I could tough it out for one night. As the woman left me to settle in, I started to notice more problems. The room smelled faintly of cat urine, and the walls were paper-thin. I could hear muffled conversations from the adjacent rooms and the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. The heater in the corner of the room was ancient and barely functioning. I cranked it up to its highest setting, but it emitted nothing but a weak, lukewarm breeze. When I ventured out to use the bathroom, things only got worse. The shared shower was grimy and cluttered with the host's personal items. Half-empty shampoo bottles, used razors, and a bar of soap that had seen better days. I was given a single hand towel to use, which looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. I returned to the room, pulled the blanket off the bed, and folded it in half to create more layers of warmth. It didn't help. The cold seeped through the mattress, and the noise from the highway outside was relentless. Every few seconds, a car or truck would roar past, making the thin window pane rattle. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. The combination of the freezing temperature, the noise, and the uncomfortable bed kept me tossing and turning all night. At one point, I even considered lying directly on the floor, hoping it might be warmer than the icy mattress. It wasn't. I wrapped myself in my coat and curled into a ball, desperately trying to generate some warmth. Hours passed. Every minute felt like an eternity. I kept glancing at my phone, counting down the hours until morning. At 5 a.m., I gave up. I packed my things, left the key on the table, and quietly slipped out of the house. The cold air outside felt oddly refreshing after the night I'd endured. I walked to the nearest cafe, ordered a steaming cup of coffee, and sat there for an hour, just letting the warmth seep into me. The experience taught me a hard lesson about trusting appearances. No matter how polished a listing looks or how good the reviews seem, it's always a gamble. I reported the host to Airbnb and left an honest review, warning others about the misleading listing and poor conditions. In hindsight, I should have trusted my instincts the moment things felt off. But sometimes, it takes a bad experience to truly appreciate the good ones. I'll still use Airbnb in the future, but I'll be far more cautious. This was a mistake I won't repeat. It was supposed to be another relaxing trip. I had booked an Airbnb in a quiet neighborhood for the weekend, a chance to escape the chaos of my life for a couple of days. The listing seemed perfect, a cozy little house with great reviews, plenty of privacy, and a price that didn't break the bank. Everything about it felt right. When I arrived, the house was just as charming as the pictures had shown. It was small but welcoming, with a white picket fence, a tidy garden, and soft, warm lighting coming from the windows. The host wasn't around, but she'd left detailed instructions about where to find the key and how to let myself in. Everything went smoothly, and I felt like I'd made a great choice. The house was simple but comfortable. A small living room with a sofa and a bookshelf, a compact kitchen, and a cozy bedroom in the back. It felt like the kind of place where you could curl up with a book and forget the world outside. I unpacked my things, made myself some tea, and settled in for the evening. At first, everything seemed fine. I had dinner, watched a little TV, and read for a while before heading to bed. The bedroom was small but nicely decorated, with a comfortable bed, soft pillows, and a thick blanket. The closet was a sliding door type that ran the length of one wall. It looked like any other closet, unremarkable and probably full of spare linens or old clothes the host didn't use anymore. That night, I started to hear noises. It was subtle at first, a faint creak, like the sound of old wood shifting under pressure. I didn't think much of it. The house was old, and old houses make noises. I told myself it was probably the wind or the foundation settling. But as the night went on, the sounds became harder to ignore. It wasn't just the occasional creak. There were soft, almost imperceptible noises, like rustling or shuffling. They seemed to be coming from the closet. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had pushed something against the wall, or maybe there were mice inside. I turned over, pulled the blanket tighter around me, and tried to fall asleep. But the noise continued, growing louder and more distinct. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and stared at the closet. The room was dimly lit by the glow of a nearby street lamp filtering through the curtains. The closet doors were closed, but I could see the faint outline of the sliding panels. My imagination started running wild. What if there was someone in there? I tried to shake the thought away, but the noise didn't stop. It was steady now, a soft scraping sound that sent chills down my spine. I told myself I was being ridiculous. There was no way anyone could be in there. I hadn't seen anything suspicious when I arrived, and the house had felt completely normal. Still, I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. Taking a deep breath, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I crept toward the closet, my bare feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. When I reached the closet, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the edge of the sliding door, trembling slightly. Part of me wanted to open it and get it over with, but another part of me wanted to run back to bed and pretend I'd heard nothing. Finally, I grabbed the handle and slid the door open. What I saw made my blood run cold. Crouched inside the closet, barely visible in the dim light, was a man. He was pressed into the corner, his knees pulled up to his chest. His eyes locked onto mine, wide and unblinking. He didn't say a word. For a moment, I couldn't move. My brain was struggling to process what I was seeing. Who was he? How did he get in? What did he want? Then, without warning, he bolted. He lunged out of the closet, knocking me to the side as he darted past me. I stumbled and fell, hitting the floor hard. By the time I scrambled to my feet, he was gone. I heard the front door slam and the sound of footsteps fading into the night. I stood there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing. Who was that man? How long had he been in the closet? Had he been watching me the whole time I was in the house? I locked the front door, double-checked all the windows, and called the police. They arrived about 20 minutes later. I explained everything as best as I could, though I was still in shock. They searched the house and the surrounding area, but didn't find him. When they asked the host about it, she seemed genuinely surprised. She told them she didn't know anyone who matched the description I gave, and insisted she'd never had any issues with the property before. But then she admitted something that made my stomach drop. She'd recently gone through a messy breakup with her boyfriend and had changed the locks just a few weeks earlier. It turned out he hadn't returned the spare key. The thought of him hiding in the closet, watching me as I went about my evening, still haunts me. I can't stop wondering what might have happened if I hadn't opened the closet when I did. Would he have stayed there all night? Or was he planning something worse? The police advised me to leave the property immediately, and I did. I checked into a hotel for the remainder of my trip and reported the incident to Airbnb. They refunded my stay and promised to investigate the host further, but the whole experience left me shaken. Since then, I've been much more cautious about where I stay and who I rent from. I always check reviews thoroughly, and I make sure to inspect every inch of the place when I arrive. But no matter how careful I am, I can't shake the memory of that man's face in the closet, his wide, unblinking eyes staring back at me in the dark. It started as a regular weekend getaway. I had been looking forward to a quiet break in the city, just some time to myself to explore, relax, and recharge. I found an Airbnb listing for a modern studio apartment in the heart of downtown. The photos looked perfect: clean lines, stylish decor, and a small balcony overlooking the bustling streets below. The host had great reviews. People wrote that she was friendly, responsive, and helpful. It all seemed legitimate. The price was fair, too, neither too cheap to be suspicious nor expensive enough to feel like I was splurging. I booked it without hesitation. When I arrived, the apartment looked just like the photos. It was a bright, airy space with sleek furniture and lots of natural light. The bed was neatly made, the countertops were spotless, and there was even a little welcome basket with snacks and bottled water. The host had left a handwritten note on the table, wishing me a pleasant stay and providing her number in case I needed anything. I spent the first day settling in and exploring the city. I visited a few local shops, grabbed coffee at a cute little cafe, and walked along the river. By the time I got back to the apartment that evening, I was tired but content. I ordered takeout, watched some TV, and then got ready for bed. The first night was uneventful. The bed was comfortable, the neighborhood was quiet, and I slept soundly. It wasn't until the next evening that things started to feel off. I was sitting on the sofa, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something strange. The TV stand in front of me had a small decorative vase on one side and some books stacked neatly on the other. But tucked between the books, barely noticeable, was a small black object. At first, I thought it was just a piece of decor, maybe a Bluetooth speaker or some kind of smart device. But something about it caught my attention. I leaned in closer to get a better look and realized it was a camera. It was small, no bigger than a matchbox, with a tiny lens pointed directly at the sofa. My stomach dropped. I stared at it for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Why was there a camera in the living room? Was it supposed to be there? Had the host mentioned it in the listing, and I just didn't notice? I stood up and started looking around the apartment more closely. I opened drawers, moved cushions, and scanned every corner of the room. That's when I found the second camera, this one hidden inside a smoke detector on the ceiling. Panic started to set in. My heart was racing as I climbed onto a chair to get a closer look. Sure enough, there was a tiny lens embedded in the smoke detector, almost invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. At this point, I was shaking. I grabbed my phone and started searching online to see if hidden cameras were allowed in Airbnb rentals. The answer was a resounding no. Hosts were allowed to have security cameras in public areas, like outside the house or at the front door, but cameras inside private spaces like the bedroom or living room were strictly forbidden. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront the host? Should I call the police? I felt violated and unsafe. Someone had been watching me, possibly the entire time I'd been there. I decided to search the rest of the apartment. My hands were trembling as I checked the bathroom. I scanned the shelves, the corners, and the ceiling. That's when I found the third camera. It was hidden inside a fake plant on the bathroom counter, positioned to face the shower. I froze. My mind was racing. How many more cameras were there? How long had they been recording? I felt exposed, like I was being watched at that very moment. I packed my things as quickly as I could, throwing everything into my suitcase without bothering to fold or organize it. I couldn't stay there another minute. I grabbed my bags, locked the door behind me, and headed straight to a nearby hotel. Once I was safely in the hotel room, I called Airbnb's customer service. The representative was sympathetic and assured me they would investigate the matter immediately. They refunded my booking and offered to cover the cost of my hotel stay. I also reported the incident to the local police. They took my statement and promised to look into it, but I never heard much about the investigation after that. I'm not sure if they were able to track down who was behind the cameras or if they were even functional, but the whole experience left me shaken. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea that someone had been watching me without my knowledge or consent was horrifying. Every time I stayed in a new place, I found myself scanning for hidden cameras, even in hotels or friends' houses. Since then, I've learned to be extra cautious when staying in unfamiliar places. I bring a flashlight with me and use it to check for reflective lenses, which can indicate a hidden camera. I also unplug or cover any devices that look suspicious, and I make sure to thoroughly read reviews before booking. The experience taught me a hard lesson about trust and privacy. While most Airbnb hosts are genuine and respectful, there are always exceptions. I'm grateful I discovered the cameras when I did, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched in a place where I thought I was safe. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, a chance to clear my mind and recharge. I found a secluded cabin on Airbnb that seemed perfect. The listing described it as cozy and private, tucked away in the woods, with no neighbors in sight. The photos showed a charming wooden cabin with a porch, surrounded by towering pine trees. The host, a woman named Sarah, seemed friendly and responsive. Her reviews were overwhelmingly positive, with guests praising her hospitality and how accurate the listing was. It felt like the ideal place to relax and disconnect for a few days. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the photos. It was small but welcoming, with a warm, rustic vibe. There was a fire pit outside, a hammock strung between two trees, and a small porch with rocking chairs. Inside, it was cozy and clean. The living room had a stone fireplace, a comfortable-looking couch, and a little kitchen with everything I needed. Sarah had left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter. "Welcome. I hope you enjoy your stay. Please let me know if you need anything. Don't forget to lock the doors and windows at night. Sarah." I didn't think much of the note at the time. Locking up at night seemed like common sense, especially in a remote area like this. I unpacked my things, made myself a cup of tea, and settled in to enjoy the peace and quiet. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it exploring the woods around the cabin, taking photos of the scenery, and reading on the porch. It was everything I had hoped for, calm, quiet, and relaxing. That evening, I made dinner and lit a fire in the fireplace. As I sat on the couch, the only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. It felt comforting, like I was finally getting the escape I needed. But as the night wore on, I started to notice things that made me uneasy. Around 10 p.m., I heard faint footsteps outside. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel path near the porch. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the footsteps sounded heavier, like a person. I froze, my heart pounding. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. I turned off the lights and peeked through the window, but I couldn't see anyone. The forest outside was pitch black, and the only light came from the dim glow of the porch lantern. The footsteps stopped, and everything went silent. I stood there for what felt like forever, listening for any other sounds. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing, just the wind or maybe a branch falling. I locked the doors and windows, as Sarah's note had suggested, and went to bed. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and the eerie feeling from the night before was almost forgotten. I spent the day hiking and enjoying the fresh air. But that evening, as the sun set and the shadows grew longer, the unease returned. I was sitting on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink, when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. It was subtle, a flicker of motion among the trees. I turned my head, but I didn't see anything. A few minutes later, it happened again. This time, I was sure I saw something, a dark figure moving between the trees. It was too far away to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. I tried to stay calm. It could have been a hiker or a hunter, though I hadn't seen any trails or signs of other people nearby. Still, the thought of someone lurking in the woods made my skin crawl. I went inside, locked the doors, and drew the curtains. I told myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise, branches creaking, leaves rustling, made my heart race. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone staring back at me. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps again. This time, they were closer. They sounded like they were right outside the cabin, circling around the porch. I grabbed my phone and tried to call Sarah, but there was no signal. The cabin was too remote for reliable service. I sat there, clutching my phone, listening to the footsteps until they faded away. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the porch, just outside the front door, was a single muddy footprint. It was larger than my own foot, and clearly left by a person. Panic set in. Someone had been outside my cabin in the middle of the night. Maybe they were just passing by, but the thought of them standing on the porch, just a few feet from where I was sleeping, terrified me. I packed my bags and left as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother to clean up or check out properly. I just threw everything into my car and drove away. I called Sarah once I was far enough away to get a signal. I told her what had happened, the footsteps, the figure in the woods, the footprint on the porch. She was quiet for a moment, then she said something that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, that must be him. He used to live there. Sometimes he forgets it's not his anymore." I asked her what she meant, but she didn't say much else. She just apologized and promised to look into it. I reported the incident to Airbnb, but they didn't seem too concerned. They refunded my stay and said they'd investigate the host, but I never heard back about it. To this day, I can't stop thinking about that cabin. Who was the man Sarah mentioned? Why was he still coming around? And what would have happened if I had confronted him? The experience left me shaken and wary. I haven't stayed in an Airbnb since, and I doubt I ever will again. The idea of being alone in a stranger's property, with no one around to help if something goes wrong, is too much for me now. I wanted a peaceful weekend in the woods, but I got something else entirely, something I'll never forget. It started as an exciting trip to a small coastal town I'd always wanted to visit. I had booked an Airbnb in a charming old house by the sea. The listing described it as a quaint, historic home with ocean views, and the photos made it look stunning. The house was painted white, with blue shutters, a large porch, and a backyard that stretched out toward the beach. The reviews were overwhelmingly positive. Guests raved about how peaceful it was and how the host, a man named Robert, was kind and attentive. I booked it without hesitation. I imagined myself relaxing on the porch, listening to the waves, and enjoying a little solitude. When I arrived, the house was just as beautiful as I had hoped. It stood at the end of a quiet lane, surrounded by tall grass and wildflowers. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, and I could hear the waves crashing in the distance. Robert was there to greet me. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. He showed me around the house, pointing out the kitchen, the cozy living room, and the bedroom upstairs. Everything was clean and well kept, with an old-fashioned charm that made me feel right at home. "Feel free to make yourself comfortable," Robert said as he handed me the keys. "I live nearby, so if you need anything, just call." I thanked him, and he left, leaving me to enjoy the house. The first day was wonderful. I walked along the beach, collected seashells, and watched the sun set over the water. The house was quiet and peaceful, and I felt lucky to have found such a perfect spot. But that night, things took a strange turn. I had just gone to bed when I heard a creaking sound from downstairs. It was faint at first, like the groan of old wood, but it grew louder as I listened. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. It sounded like someone was walking through the house, their footsteps slow and deliberate. At first, I thought it might be Robert. Maybe he had forgotten something and let himself in. But why wouldn't he have knocked or called first? I got out of bed, my heart pounding, and crept to the top of the stairs. The house was dark, but I could see faint moonlight streaming through the windows. The footsteps had stopped. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. There was no response. I stood there for a moment, listening. The house was silent except for the sound of the waves outside. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was probably just the old house settling. I went back to bed, though it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next day, I brushed off the incident and tried to enjoy my time. I explored more of the town, had lunch at a little cafe, and spent the afternoon reading on the porch. The sea breeze and warm sun helped me relax, and I almost forgot about the strange noises from the night before. But when night came, the unease returned. I was sitting in the living room, reading, when I heard a soft thud upstairs. It sounded like something had fallen or been knocked over. I froze, gripping my book tightly. The noise was followed by another, a faint scraping sound, like furniture being moved. I set the book down and stood up, my pulse racing. Slowly, I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the top, the hallway was dark, but I could make out the door to the bedroom I wasn't using. It was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had closed it earlier. I pushed the door open, my hands trembling. The room was empty, just as I had left it. The bed was untouched, and the dresser and nightstand were undisturbed. But then I noticed the window. It was open, the curtains swaying in the breeze. I walked over and closed it, latching it securely. Maybe I had forgotten to close it earlier, though I didn't remember opening it in the first place. As I turned to leave the room, I saw something on the floor near the dresser. It was a small, old-fashioned key, rusted and worn. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It didn't look like it belonged to anything in the house, at least nothing I had seen. I placed it on the dresser and went back downstairs, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had crept over me. That night, I locked my bedroom door before going to bed. I told myself it was just to be safe, but the truth was I was scared. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were restless. I woke up several times during the night, my heart racing for no reason. At one point, I thought I heard faint whispering, but when I sat up and listened, the house was silent. The next morning, I decided to leave early. I didn't have a clear explanation for what was happening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. As I packed my things, I noticed the key was missing. I had left it on the dresser in the spare bedroom, but when I went to check, it was gone. I searched the room, even checking under the furniture, but it was nowhere to be found. Feeling uneasy, I grabbed my bags and left without looking back. When I returned the keys to Robert, he asked if everything had been okay. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I didn't want to explain what had happened. I wasn't even sure I could. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something unfinished. I still don't know what to make of the noises, the open window, or the mysterious key. Maybe it was all in my head, or maybe there was more to that old house than I realized. One thing is certain. I'll never forget the eerie sense of being watched, even when I thought I was alone. It all started as an exciting opportunity for a fresh start. I had just gotten a remote job and decided to take a month-long break from my busy city life. I wanted to work somewhere quieter, surrounded by nature. After a bit of searching on Airbnb, I came across the perfect listing, a small, isolated cottage nestled in the mountains. The photos showed a cozy, rustic home with a stone fireplace, wooden beams, and large windows that looked out onto rolling hills and endless trees. The description said it was perfect for writers, artists, or anyone seeking peace and solitude. It sounded ideal for me. The host, a man named Michael, had excellent reviews. Guests praised him for being welcoming and quick to respond to any issues. They also mentioned how the cottage was even better in person than in the photos. I booked it without hesitation. When I arrived, the drive up to the cottage was just as picturesque as I'd imagined. A narrow dirt road wound through dense forests, with patches of sunlight streaming through the trees. The air smelled fresh and earthy, and I couldn't hear a single car or voice, just birds and the rustling of leaves. The cottage itself was beautiful. It sat on a small hill, surrounded by wildflowers and tall grass. A wooden fence ran along the property, and there was a tiny garden in the back. Michael wasn't there to greet me, but he'd left a note on the kitchen counter, welcoming me and providing the Wi-Fi password. He also mentioned that cell service was spotty in the area, but the landline phone in the living room worked if I needed to contact him. I spent the first day unpacking, exploring the cottage, and settling into the routine of working remotely. The inside of the house had a warm, inviting charm. There was a big wooden desk by the window, perfect for my laptop, and a cozy reading nook by the fireplace. That night, after a productive day of work, I made myself dinner and curled up with a book. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the stars were so bright they lit up the night sky. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. But things started to feel strange the following evening. I was sitting at the desk, finishing up some work, when I noticed movement outside the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving the tall grass. But when I looked closer, I saw a figure standing near the fence. It was too dark to make out any details, but the shape of a person was unmistakable. They were standing completely still, facing the house. My heart started pounding. I stared at the figure, hoping they would move or wave, or do something to show they were harmless. But they didn't. They just stood there motionless, as if they were watching me. I closed the curtains and tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was a neighbor, though Michael's listing had said the nearest house was miles away. Or maybe it was a hiker who'd gotten lost and wandered onto the property. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. I locked the doors and went to bed, though I kept the lights on. The next morning, I went outside to check near the fence. The grass was tall and untouched, with no sign that anyone had been there. It made me doubt what I'd seen the night before. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But that night, it happened again. This time, I was in the living room, watching TV. I'd drawn the curtains earlier, but I could still feel a sense of unease, like someone was nearby. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard a soft knock on the window. I froze. My stomach churned as I stared at the curtains, waiting for something else to happen. The knock came again, louder this time. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and pulled the curtains aside. There was no one there. I shined the flashlight outside, sweeping the beam across the yard and toward the fence. Nothing. The grass swayed gently in the wind, and the garden was empty. I told myself it must have been a branch tapping against the window or some other innocent explanation. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The next day, I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see the figure again. That night, I decided to stay up late and keep the lights on. I thought maybe if someone really was out there, they'd be less likely to approach a well-lit house. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. They were faint at first, crunching on the gravel near the front porch. Then they grew louder, circling around the house. I sat frozen on the couch, gripping my phone. I tried to call Michael, but there was no signal. I thought about using the landline, but who would I call? The police? I didn't even know the address of the cottage. The footsteps stopped, and everything went quiet. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening to the sound of my own breathing. Suddenly, there was a loud bang at the back door, like someone trying to force it open. I jumped up and ran to the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the drawer. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. There was no response, just another loud bang. I grabbed the landline and dialed Michael's number. It rang twice before he picked up. "Hello," he said groggily. "Someone's outside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're trying to get in." Michael was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Stay inside. Lock the doors. I'll be there as soon as I can." He hung up before I could say anything else. I locked myself in the bedroom and waited, clutching the knife and the phone. The banging stopped after a while, but I didn't dare leave the room. About an hour later, I heard a car pull up outside. I peeked out the window and saw Michael stepping out of his truck, holding a flashlight. I ran to the door and let him in. He looked concerned but calm, like this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay. I explained what had happened, and he walked around the property, checking the doors and windows. "There's no sign of anyone now," he said when he came back inside. "But I'll stay the night, just in case." I didn't ask him why he was so prepared for this, or why he seemed so unsurprised. I was too tired and scared to care. Michael slept on the couch, and I stayed in the bedroom, but I didn't get much sleep. The next morning, I told him I was leaving. He didn't try to convince me to stay or offer an explanation for what had happened. He just nodded and said, "I understand." As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Michael knew more than he was letting on. Maybe it was just a random trespasser, but something about his reaction made me think otherwise. I never found out who, or what, was outside the cottage that night. But I've never booked a remote Airbnb again, and I doubt I ever will. The memory of those footsteps and the banging on the door still haunts me, a reminder that even the most peaceful places can hide dark secrets. I had always dreamed of taking a long break from my busy urban life. Between my hectic schedule and the endless noise of the city, I felt like I was losing myself. So when I got the chance to work remotely for a month, I knew it was the perfect opportunity to escape. I wanted solitude and a deep connection with nature. After browsing Airbnb for days, I found what seemed like the perfect listing: a small, isolated cottage in the mountains. It was advertised as a place for artists, writers, and those seeking peace. The photos showed a charming little house with wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a view that stretched out to endless green hills. The reviews were overwhelmingly positive. Guests wrote about how serene and inspiring the place was. A few mentioned the host, Michael, as being incredibly kind and helpful. Everything sounded ideal, so I booked it for the entire month without hesitation. The day I arrived, the drive itself was a dream. The road wound through thick forests, sunlight streaming through the leaves. The air smelled crisp and earthy, and there wasn't a single car or house in sight. It felt like stepping into a different world, a quieter, more peaceful one. As I approached the cottage, it looked even more beautiful than the photos. Nestled on a hill, it had a small porch, a charming wooden fence, and a tiny garden filled with wildflowers. The surrounding forest seemed to go on forever. I parked my car and stepped out, taking a deep breath. Michael wasn't there to greet me in person, but he'd left a note on the kitchen counter. It welcomed me warmly, provided the Wi-Fi password, and included a reminder that cell service was unreliable in the area. He also wrote that the landline in the living room worked if I needed to contact him or anyone else. The cottage was everything I'd hoped for. The living room had a cozy couch and a large stone fireplace. The kitchen was small but functional, with wooden cabinets and a charming farmhouse sink. Upstairs, the bedroom had a wide window that offered a stunning view of the hills. There was even a wooden desk by the window where I could set up my laptop and work. The first day was perfect. I spent hours unpacking and settling in, followed by a long walk around the property. The silence was profound, broken only by birdsong and the occasional rustle of leaves. That night, I made myself dinner, curled up on the couch with a book, and listened to the distant sound of the wind. I didn't realize how deeply I'd needed this kind of quiet until that moment. The second night was when I noticed something strange. After a productive day of work, I was sitting at the desk, finishing up some emails. It was already dark outside, and the room was lit by the warm glow of the desk lamp. As I worked, I thought I saw a movement outside the window. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just the wind moving the tall grass. But then I saw it again, a figure standing near the fence at the edge of the yard. My hands froze over the keyboard. The figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there, facing the house. I tried to tell myself it was probably a neighbor or a hiker who had wandered onto the property. But Michael's listing had specifically mentioned that the nearest house was miles away, and the forest wasn't exactly a popular hiking spot. I stared at the figure for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to move. My heart was racing, my palms damp with sweat. Finally, I stood up and turned off the desk lamp, hoping to get a better look without the glare on the window. When I looked back, the figure was gone. I locked the doors and closed all the curtains, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, a trick of the shadows. After all, I was alone in an unfamiliar place. It was natural to feel a little jumpy. But that explanation didn't stop me from sleeping with the lights on. The next day, I went outside to check near the fence. The grass was tall and undisturbed, with no footprints or signs that anyone had been there. I felt a little foolish for being so spooked the night before. I spent the day exploring the nearby forest and catching up on work. By evening, I was starting to feel more relaxed again. The cottage felt cozy and safe, and I told myself I was just overthinking things. But later that night, as I was watching TV in the living room, I heard a soft knock on the window. I froze. The knock came again, louder this time. My stomach dropped. I sat completely still, staring at the curtains that covered the window. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a tree branch or an animal. But it sounded deliberate, like someone tapping with their knuckles. Summoning my courage, I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and walked to the window. My hands were shaking as I pulled the curtain aside. There was no one there. I shined the flashlight outside, sweeping the beam across the yard. Everything looked normal. The garden was empty, the fence was undisturbed, and the tall grass swayed gently in the wind. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was nothing. But deep down, I felt uneasy. That night, I decided to stay up late and keep all the lights on. I thought that if someone really was out there, they'd be less likely to approach a brightly lit house. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind. But then they grew louder, crunching on the gravel near the front porch. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I sat frozen on the couch, clutching my phone. The footsteps moved around the house, slow and deliberate. I tried to call Michael, but as expected, there was no cell service. I thought about using the landline, but who would I call? I didn't even know the address of the cottage. Suddenly, there was a loud bang at the back door, like someone trying to force it open. I jumped up and ran to the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the drawer. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold it. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. There was no response, just another loud bang. Panicking, I grabbed the landline and dialed Michael's number. It rang twice before he answered, his voice groggy. "Hello. Someone's outside," I whispered urgently. "They're trying to get in." Michael was silent for a moment, then said, "Stay inside. Lock the doors. I'll be there as soon as I can." He hung up before I could say anything else. I locked myself in the bedroom, clutching the knife and the phone. The banging continued for a few minutes, then stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I sat in the corner of the room, shaking, until I finally heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. Michael arrived about an hour later. He stepped out of his truck, holding a flashlight. When I opened the door, he looked concerned, but not surprised. It was as if he'd been expecting something like this to happen. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay. I told him everything that had happened. The figure near the fence, the knocking, the footsteps, and the banging at the door. Michael listened quietly, then walked around the property, checking the doors and windows. "There's no sign of anyone now," he said when he came back inside. "But I'll stay the night, just in case." I didn't ask him why he was so calm or why he seemed so prepared for this. I was too tired and scared to care. Michael slept on the couch, and I stayed in the bedroom, but I didn't get much sleep. Every little sound made my heart race. The next morning, I packed my bags and told Michael I was leaving. He didn't try to convince me to stay or offer an explanation for what had happened. He just nodded and said, "I understand." As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Michael knew more than he was letting on. Maybe it was just a random trespasser, but something about his reaction made me think otherwise. I still don't know who, or what, was outside the cottage that night. But I've never booked a remote Airbnb again, and I doubt I ever will. The memory of those footsteps, the knocking, and the banging on the door still haunts me, a chilling reminder that even the most peaceful places can hide dark secrets. The decision to book a remote Airbnb was one I had been thinking about for months. Life in the city had become suffocating, constant noise, endless crowds, and the daily grind that left me feeling drained. When my company announced we could work remotely for a while, I jumped at the chance to escape. After browsing through dozens of listings, I found what seemed like the perfect place, a small, isolated cottage nestled in the mountains. The photos were like something out of a storybook: wooden beams, a stone fireplace, large windows looking out onto rolling green hills, and not another house in sight. The description was even better: a quiet retreat for artists, writers, and those seeking solitude. The host, Michael, had glowing reviews. Guests called him friendly, helpful, and responsive. Some even mentioned that the cottage was better in real life than in the pictures. It all sounded too good to be true. The drive to the cottage was nothing short of magical. As I left the city behind, the roads became quieter, winding through dense forests and small, sleepy towns. By the time I turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the property, I felt like I was entering another world. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of pine. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I rolled down my windows and let the breeze wash over me, relishing the silence. When I finally pulled up to the cottage, it was just as beautiful as the pictures had promised. Perched on a small hill, it looked cozy and inviting. A wooden fence bordered the property, and a wildflower garden added a pop of color to the rustic setting. The surrounding forest stretched out as far as the eye could see, with no other houses in sight. Michael wasn't there to greet me, but he'd left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter. It welcomed me to the cottage and included the Wi-Fi password, a few recommendations for local hiking trails, and a reminder that cell service was unreliable in the area. He'd also written that if I needed anything, I could use the landline in the living room to call him directly. The interior of the cottage was just as charming as the outside. The living room had a stone fireplace and a plush couch that looked perfect for curling up with a book. The kitchen was small but functional, with wooden cabinets and a cozy breakfast nook. Upstairs, the bedroom had a large window that framed the hills like a painting. I unpacked, set up my laptop at the desk by the window, and spent the rest of the day exploring the property. I walked along the fence, admired the garden, and even ventured a little way into the forest. By evening, I was feeling completely at peace. That first night, I sat by the fireplace, reading and sipping tea as the wind rustled the trees outside. It was everything I'd hoped for, a break from the chaos of my everyday life. The next evening, I was sitting at the desk finishing some emails. The sun had set, and the room was bathed in the warm glow of the desk lamp. I was focused on my work when a sudden movement outside the window caught my eye. I looked up, expecting to see a deer or some other wildlife. But instead, I saw the silhouette of a person standing near the fence. I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard. The figure was completely still, facing the house. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as I stared, it became clear it was definitely a person. My mind raced with questions. Who could it be? Michael had said the nearest house was miles away, and the forest didn't seem like a popular hiking spot. Why would someone be out there at this hour, just standing silently? I debated whether to go outside and confront them, but fear kept me rooted to my chair. Instead, I turned off the desk lamp, hoping to see more clearly without the glare. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. I spent the rest of the night on edge, double-checking that all the doors and windows were locked. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a neighbor passing through, maybe, or a trick of the shadows. But I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. The following day, I went outside to inspect the area near the fence. The grass was tall and undisturbed, with no footprints or signs that anyone had been there. It made me question what I'd seen the night before. Maybe it really had been my imagination. The day passed without incident. I focused on my work and tried to enjoy the serenity of the cottage. By evening, I was starting to feel more relaxed again. That night, I decided to watch a movie in the living room. I'd drawn the curtains earlier, but even with them closed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see the silhouette again. And then I heard it, a soft knock on the window. My heart skipped a beat. The knock came again, louder this time. I sat frozen on the couch, gripping the blanket I'd wrapped around myself. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be an animal? A branch tapping against the glass? Or was it someone? Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and approached the window. My hands were trembling as I pulled the curtain aside. There was no one there. I shined the flashlight outside, sweeping the beam across the yard. The garden was empty, the fence untouched, the grass swaying gently in the wind. Everything looked normal, yet I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had taken hold of me. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to every creak and rustle. The next night, I resolved to stay up late and keep all the lights on. I thought that if someone really was lurking around, they'd be less likely to approach a brightly lit house. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind. But then they grew louder, crunching on the gravel near the front porch. I sat completely still, my pulse racing. The footsteps moved around the house, slow and deliberate, as if whoever it was wanted me to hear them. My phone was useless without cell service, and I didn't know what to do. Should I confront them? Stay hidden? Suddenly, there was a loud bang at the back door, like someone trying to force it open. I jumped up and grabbed the kitchen knife I'd left on the counter earlier. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. There was no response, just another loud bang. Panicking, I ran to the living room and grabbed the landline phone. I dialed Michael's number, my fingers fumbling over the buttons. "Hello," he answered groggily after a few rings. "Michael, someone's outside." I whispered urgently. "They're trying to get in." He was silent for a moment, then said, "Lock the doors and stay inside. I'll be there as soon as I can." He hung up before I could say anything else. I locked myself in the bedroom, clutching the knife and the phone. The banging continued for a few more minutes, then stopped. The The silence that followed was almost worse. I sat in the corner of the room, listening to the sound of my own breathing and praying for morning to come. It was nearly an hour later when I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. I peeked out the window and saw Michael stepping out of his truck, holding a flashlight. When I opened the door, he looked concerned but oddly calm, as if this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, though I felt anything but okay. I told him about the footsteps, the banging, and the figure I'd seen near the fence. Michael listened quietly, then walked around the property, checking the doors, windows, and yard. "There's no sign of anyone now," he said when he came back inside. "But I'll stay the night, just in case." He didn't offer any explanations for what had happened, and I didn't press him. I was too exhausted and shaken to care. Michael slept on the couch that night, while I stayed in the bedroom. I barely slept, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, I packed my bags and told Michael I was leaving. He didn't try to stop me or convince me to stay. He simply nodded and said, "I understand." As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Michael knew more than he was letting on. Maybe it was just a random trespasser, or maybe there was something about the area he hadn't told me. I never found out who, or what, was outside the cottage that night. But the memory of those footsteps and the banging on the door still haunts me, a chilling reminder that even the most peaceful places can hide dark secrets. When I booked an Airbnb for my solo vacation, I wasn't looking for luxury or excitement. I wanted peace. After years of putting off vacations, I finally carved out a long weekend to unwind and recharge. I chose a quaint house in a small coastal town far from the bustle of my city life. The listing promised charm, tranquility, and proximity to the beach, a perfect getaway. The host, Claire, had rave reviews. Guests called her warm and accommodating, mentioning how spotless the house was and how she always left thoughtful little touches like fresh flowers or a basket of snacks. The photos showed a cozy, whitewashed cottage with a wraparound porch, bright blue shutters, and a garden that overflowed with lavender and wildflowers. The reviews and pictures were convincing, but what sealed the deal for me was the location. The cottage was tucked away on a quiet road surrounded by trees, with the ocean just a short walk away. It sounded perfect. I arrived on a sunny Friday afternoon, eager to leave behind the chaos of my job and the constant noise of the city. The drive had been long but scenic, taking me through winding roads, past fields of golden wheat, and stretches of sparkling coastline. When I pulled up to the cottage, it was just as picturesque as I'd imagined. The white walls practically glowed in the sunlight, and the air was filled with the faint, salty scent of the sea. There was a handwritten note taped to the front door, welcoming me and telling me where to find the key. Inside, the house was even more charming than I'd expected. The living room had a soft, oversized couch piled with cushions, a well-stocked bookshelf, and a fireplace with a stack of wood ready to use. The kitchen was small but fully equipped, with jars of herbs lining the windowsill and a vase of fresh flowers on the table. Upstairs, the bedroom was bright and airy, with crisp white linens, a bay window that overlooked the garden, and soft rugs that felt luxurious underfoot. It was perfect in every way. I unpacked my things, made myself a cup of tea, and settled into the couch with a book. The quiet was exactly what I'd been craving. The only sounds were the gentle rustle of leaves outside and the occasional chirping of birds. For the first time in months, I felt myself relax. That evening, after a simple dinner, I went for a walk to explore the area. The road outside the cottage was quiet, bordered by tall trees and wildflowers. About 10 minutes down the road, I found a narrow path that led to the beach. The beach was almost deserted, except for a couple walking their dog in the distance. The sand was cool under my feet, and the waves lapped gently against the shore. I stayed until the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. By the time I got back to the cottage, it was dark, and the air had turned chilly. I locked the doors, lit a fire in the fireplace, and settled into bed with a sense of contentment. But as I was drifting off to sleep, I thought I heard something. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or the house settling. But then it came again, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound seemed to be coming from the front door. Heart pounding, I crept downstairs, my phone clutched in one hand and a flashlight in the other. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, my eyes fixed on the front door. The scratching stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the noise to return. But the house was silent. Finally, I convinced myself it had been nothing, a branch scraping against the door or an animal outside. I double-checked that the door was locked, then went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy, but determined to shake off the unease from the night before. I spent the day exploring the little town nearby, browsing its tiny shops and enjoying a long lunch at a cafe by the water. By the time I returned to the cottage, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the garden. I noticed something odd as I walked up to the front door. Faint marks on the wood, near the bottom of the doorframe. They looked like scratches, though I couldn't be sure. I bent down for a closer look, but the fading light made it hard to see. Dismissing it as wear and tear, I unlocked the door and went inside. That evening, I built another fire and curled up on the couch with a movie. The cozy atmosphere helped me relax, and for a while, I felt like I was in my own little sanctuary. But as the hours passed, the unease I'd felt the night before started creeping back. The house was too quiet, and every little creak or rustle set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, just as I was about to head upstairs to bed, I heard it again, the scratching. This time, it was louder and more insistent. I froze, my eyes darting to the front door. The sound continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. Gripping my flashlight, I slowly approached the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might drown out the sound. "Hello." I called out, my voice shaking. The scratching stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, a soft thud came from the other side of the door, as if something heavy had been dropped. Fear prickled at the back of my neck. I wanted to fling the door open and see what was out there, but the rational part of me screamed to stay inside. I backed away, double-checking that the door was locked, and ran upstairs to the bedroom. I locked the door behind me, grabbed my phone, and tried to call Claire. No service. I stared at the screen in frustration, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Who could I call? I sat on the bed, clutching my phone and the flashlight, listening intently. The scratching didn't come back, but the night felt heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The next morning, I found more scratches on the front door, long, deep gouges that hadn't been there the day before. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was out there. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog, but the logical part of me knew better. The marks were too deliberate, too precise. I called Claire from the cottage's landline and told her what had been happening. She sounded surprised and concerned, apologizing profusely and promising to drive over to check on me. While I waited for her to arrive, I tried to stay busy. I cleaned the kitchen, tidied up the living room, and even went for a short walk down the road. But the scratches on the door were always at the back of my mind. Claire arrived in the early afternoon, her face lined with worry. She inspected the scratches and seemed genuinely baffled. "This has never happened before," she said, shaking her head. "I've had dozens of guests here, and no one's ever mentioned anything like this." She offered to stay the night to make sure I felt safe, but I assured her I'd be fine. I didn't want to inconvenience her, and honestly, part of me felt silly for being so rattled. That night, I went to bed early, hoping to get some rest before heading back home the next morning. I locked all the doors and windows, checked every room, and even left the hallway light on. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, willing myself to relax. But as the hours ticked by, my unease grew. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of banging. It was loud and forceful, shaking the walls of the cottage. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. The noise was coming from the front door, followed by the unmistakable sound of scratching. This time, it was relentless. Gripping my flashlight, I crept to the bedroom window and peered outside. The porch light cast a dim glow, but I couldn't see anyone or anything near the door. I wanted to run, to get in my car and drive as far away as possible. But the thought of opening the door, even for a second, filled me with dread. The banging and scratching continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stayed awake until dawn, my body tense and my mind racing. When the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, I grabbed my bags and left without looking back. I never found out what had been outside the cottage that weekend. Claire called me a few days later to apologize again, but she had no answers either. She'd checked the property thoroughly and found no signs of anyone or anything that could have caused the scratches or banging. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but the memory of those sounds, the deep scratches on the door, and the overwhelming sense of dread still haunts me. I haven't stayed in an Airbnb since. I've always been a fan of traveling. It was a way for me to escape my everyday life, see new places, and meet new people. When I decided to visit a small town in the countryside, I turned to Airbnb for a place to stay. I was looking for something cozy and peaceful, away from the noise of city life. I found a listing that looked perfect, an old farmhouse surrounded by fields and nature. The pictures showed a lovely rustic home, with a large front porch and a garden full of flowers. The reviews were glowing, and the host, James, seemed very friendly. It felt like the perfect spot for a quiet weekend getaway. I arrived at the farmhouse on a Friday afternoon. The drive had been longer than expected, but the scenery was beautiful, rolling hills, small cottages, and the kind of countryside I had always imagined. As I pulled up to the farmhouse, I felt a sense of peace. The house stood tall against the horizon, surrounded by trees and fields that stretched on for miles. The front porch had a swing, and the garden was full of colorful blooms. It looked exactly like the photos on the listing, if not better. James greeted me at the door with a warm smile. He was an older man, in his late 50s, with a gentle demeanor. He explained the basic details about the house, how to use the fireplace, where to find the towels and sheets, and the best places to visit in the area. Everything about him felt genuine and welcoming. "The house has been in my family for generations," James told me, his voice filled with pride. "It's a bit old, but it's full of character." I smiled and nodded, thinking how lucky I was to have found such a place. I was eager to unwind, so I thanked him for the warm welcome, grabbed my bags, and headed inside. The inside of the farmhouse had a charming, rustic feel. The living room had wooden floors and a large stone fireplace. There were old pictures on the walls, some of James and his family, others of the farmhouse through the years. A large wooden dining table sat in the center of the room, and the kitchen, though small, was well equipped with everything I needed. It wasn't the most modern place, but it was cozy and inviting. I chose the bedroom upstairs. The bed was big, with soft sheets and a thick quilt that looked like it had been passed down through generations. I unpacked my things, laid out my clothes for the weekend, and then sat by the window for a while, looking out over the fields. Everything was peaceful. The only sounds I could hear were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. It felt like a dream come true. After unpacking, I decided to explore the area a bit. I walked around the property, taking in the beauty of the countryside. There was a small barn out back, a few sheds, and a long gravel path that led to a nearby forest. Everything about the place felt tranquil, and I could see myself enjoying a few days here. That night, I made a simple dinner in the kitchen, enjoying the quiet atmosphere of the house. It was the kind of place where you could just relax and forget about the rest of the world. After dinner, I sat by the fire, reading a book and sipping tea. It was so quiet that I could hear the crackling of the logs in the fireplace. But then, around 9 p.m., I heard something strange. It was a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on the door. I stood up, confused. I hadn't heard anyone approach the house, and James had said he would be busy with other things for the rest of the evening. I checked the door, but there was no one there. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just the wind or some animal outside. I went back to my chair by the fire, but then the tapping came again. This time, it was louder. It sounded more like someone trying to get in, but when I looked through the window, there was still no one around. My heart started to race. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was probably just the house settling or the wind, but there was something unsettling about it. The tapping continued for a few more minutes before it stopped altogether. I sat still, listening carefully. The silence that followed felt even more intense. The next day, I tried to forget about the strange knocking. I went into town to explore and grabbed lunch at a small cafe. The day was bright and sunny, and I enjoyed the calm atmosphere. I didn't think about the farmhouse's strange noises at all. But as the sun began to set, I returned to the house, and that nagging feeling returned. It was hard to explain, but I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't quite right. The house felt a little too quiet, a little too still. I started hearing odd sounds again, footsteps in the hallway, a creaking floorboard, and a faint rustling noise from upstairs. It was as if someone else was in the house, but I was completely alone. I decided to investigate. I checked every room, even the attic, but everything seemed fine. I couldn't find any sign that someone else was there, yet the feeling didn't go away. It was like I was being watched, but no one was there. Later that night, after another quiet dinner, I went to bed, trying to ignore the sense of unease in my chest. I told myself I was just being paranoid. But as I lay in bed, I heard something again, the sound of footsteps, slowly walking down the hallway. My heart raced. I lay perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. There was no one there, I was sure of it. But the sound was real. I could hear it as clearly as I could hear my own heartbeat. After what felt like hours, the footsteps faded away. But I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, my eyes wide open, waiting for whatever would happen next. By the third night, I was exhausted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but I didn't know what. The house felt too still, too quiet, and the odd noises continued, footsteps, tapping, rustling. But there was never anyone to explain them. I started to wonder if the house itself had a history, something James hadn't mentioned. I thought about asking him, but the thought of confronting him made me uneasy. What if he didn't believe me? What if he thought I was overreacting? Around 10 p.m., as I was sitting in the living room, I heard a loud bang from upstairs. I jumped to my feet, my heart racing. The sound had come from the bedroom area, and I was suddenly filled with dread. I grabbed my phone and called James, but there was no answer. I tried again and again, but it went straight to voicemail. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things, rushed out of the house, and drove into town to a small inn. I couldn't explain it, but I needed to get out of there. I felt like I wasn't alone, like something was lurking just out of sight, watching me. When I checked out the next morning, I tried to text James and explain that I had left, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him the full story. I didn't want him to think I was crazy. The whole experience felt too surreal. But when I returned home, I couldn't shake the memories of the farmhouse, the strange noises, the feeling of being watched, the footsteps that never made sense. When I got back, I did a little research about the farmhouse. To my surprise, I found an old article about a fire that had occurred on the property many years ago, long before James had taken over. The fire had damaged part of the house, and there were rumors that the previous owners had experienced strange things too. Noises, cold spots, and the feeling of someone walking around when no one was there. I wasn't sure if it was just coincidence, but it seemed like the house had a history of odd events. I never did hear back from James after I left, and part of me is relieved I didn't press him for more information. The last thing I wanted was to learn that something darker was lurking in that farmhouse. I've never stayed in an Airbnb in the countryside since. The memories of those nights are enough to make me think twice about booking a secluded place again.